morning, everyone. It's great that you're here. Thank you so much. I am yet to lead a conversation about another controversial topic. We had a lot of anti-ESG versus ESG conversations happening yesterday. Today we're going to discuss another word that is coming up a lot, the D word. We have California moving to try to have its pension funds divest from fossil fuels companies. Meanwhile, we have activists complaining that engagement isn't enough, that we need to do more. So this conversation, we're going to explore the case for engagement, why it can be effective, how it can be effective, and we're going to come out on the other side and we'll see where we land. I am so privileged to have some really terrific participants today for this panel. Lynn Forrester de Rothschild is the co-founder and founder and co-chair of a lot of things, but also including the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, and Ron O'Hanley, chairman and CEO of State Street. He has a lot of thoughts on engagement, and he was actually kind enough to come to us last year too and talk a little bit about this topic. So Lynn, before we get really into the questions, I wanted to just spend a moment on the Council for Inclusive Capitalism and just understand for the audience a little bit of an elevator pitch on it and why that's important. You know, what defined this concept of inclusive capitalism for us?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that question, and thank you to everyone for being here. The Council for Inclusive Capitalism is really a group of investors and corporate leaders who believe that we need to reform the market system so it's more inclusive and more sustainable. That's in a word. We founded it with Pope Francis for a very specific reason, which is that while we all are doing our work and trying to do the right thing, often missed in the narrative is the moral imperative. And I wrote Pope Francis and said that I've been working for 10 years with leaders like Ron O'Hanley, who I know are doing the doing. But it's a little bit like when Mario Cuomo said that politicians campaign in poetry, but they govern in prose. And I felt like we doing our thing, our ISSB, our TCFD, that to the world at large, that's just prose, and there's not poetry. And so the council is meant to be a place where society in general can go to a website and see, again, companies like State Street and many others, there are over 400, that are making commitments and are doing things. But in the context of the poetry of what Pope Francis said in the Laudato Si in 2015, that great year, same year that the Sustainable Development Goals were incorporated, and TCFD was started when he said that we need to listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor.
Now, earlier this year, you said in an interview, we must do more to advocate for engagement, not divestment, as an effective investor strategy when it comes to the energy transition. Why do you think we should prioritize engagement?
I think we should prioritize engagement because we have a real problem to solve. And you cannot solve a problem without going into the problem. And if you take the oil and gas industry alone, that's almost 18% of greenhouse gases. If we don't go into that problem and get them to change what they're doing, we're not going to solve the energy crisis. We might feel good because everything we're invested in is green, but if we're invested in financials, technology, healthcare, we're not solving the climate. We're solving maybe our portfolio, and maybe we're feeling good about the way we're investing our money. So I think that the point is to go into the problem. And then when you go into the problem, what do? I think it's fair to say that as an industry, the investment industry has not engaged deeply enough, that more could be done. And that's fair criticism, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't engage. I mean, I think what happened at Exxon, while it's not perfect, and it can't happen at every company probably, but the idea that people are in the boardroom. Exxon is not the best at low carbon solutions, but it's moved in the right direction. Mm-hmm. And I think the pressure from engagement has moved people. In 2015, 0.8% of oil and gas CapEx was in renewables. It was 8.6% this year. Still not enough, but I think the more we engage and the more we have positive legislative reform like the IRA, the quicker we will be in the problem and actually make a change, not of our portfolio, but a change of the climate problem.
Yeah. I'm going to park my next question for a moment, but I want to come to Ron first, because State Street's been part of the council since it was announced in 2020. Mm-hmm. You were motivated to join I would love to hear the motivation. And I want to hear also your thoughts on why you see engagement as necessary for the energy transition. So why was State Street motivated to join the council, and how does that pertain to this engagement?
I mean, a lot of reasons for joining the council, but probably the most important one was just the sheer convening power of the Pope, who brought together in those initial meetings people that you never thought would be together in the same room to try and address this problem. And working with Lynn and the Pope and having a wide range of industries and investors together saying, we're not going to talk here about threatening to divest from you, but how can we ensure that the capital that we're providing as investors on behalf of asset owners is actually being used to help the transition to net zero, which in many ways speaks to the second part of your question, divestment versus engagement. Divestment makes people feel good, but it has nothing to do with atmospheric decarbonization, right? If I sell Exxon out of my portfolio or I sell oil and gas out of my portfolio, that's great. I have a decarbonized portfolio, but the air you and I are all breathing hasn't changed. The amount of carbon in the atmosphere hasn't changed. And the realities are that if you want to get at the problem, you have to identify the high-emitting industries, and you have to invest in them so they become low-emitting industries. So divestment is almost the opposite of what we need to do. And the second reality of all this is transition takes time. We can't wish overnight that fossil fuels would go away, that we'd be to an all-electric economy powered by renewables. We actually have to get there, and that requires investment. So for us, engagement has always been the way we've operated. Now, part of that is also a large portion of our portfolios are index portfolios. So divestment really isn't an option for us. I can't turn the S&P 500 into the S&P 499 because I don't like Exxon, just to keep picking on Exxon. But it's rather about we're the long-term holders. We're the closest thing to permanent capital in public markets. So what our focus is on is, given that we're long-term, we're very concerned not just about what happens next quarter, but over the next decade. What are you company doing to actually make sure that you're thriving and that your activities are leading to a better world? The only way you get there is through engagement.
What I would add to that, and it's a shout out to State Street, is the sort of blind spot in the environmental movement was the spot about people. Remember, the Pope said, "Listen to the cry of the earth and the poor." And the environmental movement didn't take into account that if we shut down all the oil and gas, where would those workers go? Number one. Number two, who could afford the cost of energy? We all are in this beautifully air-conditioned room. I flew up today. We're living these lives. And what State Street joined with the council is we did a project called the Just Energy Transition to look at factors not only of greenhouse gas emissions, but also what is the impact of the transition on workers and communities and the consumer, which I think is a really important holistic way that we need to look at the problem of decarbonizing. I think if we had done this earlier in the environmental movement, we would have had much more buy-in across society, because it started out as a pretty elitist thing. The tree huggers and all of that.
Yeah, and Lynn's point is very important. There's two fundamental fairness questions here. One is, as you look at how climate change is playing out, a disproportionate amount of it is hitting developed markets. When if you think about what their carbon emissions has been over the last 100 years, it's been minimal. So in some respects, minimal carbon emissions bearing the brunt of, or much of the brunt of climate change. The second element of fairness is it really appropriate for the developed world to be saying, listen, you can't go and use coal. We don't want you building power plants. When you're ready for renewables, then go ahead. But in the meantime, stop your development until you get there. It's not realistic, right? You can't ask these countries to stop their development. So what's required is, how do you help these countries actually skip over some of the things that the developed world went through? I mean, we went through, a wood economy, a coal economy, an oil economy, a fossil fuel economy. Now we're moving on to hopefully a post-fossil fuel renewable economy. The best thing we can do, if you really were thinking about what's the single best thing you could do to decarbonize the atmosphere, because remember, it knows no borders, help India skip over coal. Help India skip over fossil fuels. And so that's the other part of why the council was so important in terms of bringing that forward and saying, how do we invest? How do we think about whatever kind of policies we're going to be advocating for to get at this fairness issue, and also just make it more realistic that if we really want to do something here, let's avoid the kind of mass coal generation in the developed world, and help the developing world, and help the developing world skip that step in development.
And we have a sad fact that President Macron, you've probably read about it, President Macron and Prime Minister Mia Mottley, from the amazing woman from Barbados, they held a global summit on how to solve the problem that Ron is talking about, and it sort of came up with nothing.
Yeah.
The developed world did not send. Janet Yellen was there, in fairness, but Germany didn't send anyone until the dinner. France tried to do something. Italy did nothing. So there's a real disconnect between the enormous problem that Ron is talking about and the real willingness of the world to invest in solving it.
So let's go back to the how, right? To how we make these engagements happen. Ron, when we talked last year, you gave the example of an oil company that State Street engaged with. You convinced it to support a shareholder proposal related to methane disclosures. Do you have a more recent example? I'd love to hear some examples of a successful engagement that pushed us closer to this transition. Yeah.
Well, the methane disclosures was actually quite important, because methane really is the silent killer when it comes to pouring carbon into the atmosphere. And so helping investors understand what methane is being produced by the activities of a company and what you're doing about it is quite important. Again, the only thing we said is, how you extract your fossil fuels, that's up to you, but investors need to know what are the costs of that. And that's been very successful. More recently, the focus has been around deforestation. Because if you think about it, a massive bet that we're all making is on carbon offsets. And how do we maintain and actually grow forests? How do we stop the destruction of forests? Because we're going to need those forests. Ultimately, we're going to be producing carbon for a long time, and forests are a major offset for that. So to ask businesses, or ask in this case, it was large banks, can you help us identify, as part of your disclosures, the various disclosures you're making, what are you doing to enable or to prevent deforestation? So that would be a second area where and it's not just us, other investors are focused on this issue too.
I'm wondering, Lynn, if you can offer a quick example, and we're actually winding down quickly, so I have two more areas I want to hit, but do you have another example?
I have a specific company example, and Jeff Ubben from Inclusive Capital Partners really is the one who did this. In 2017, long story short, AES was a maligned energy company with 85% coal. Jeff went to the CEO who understood he needed to move to renewables, but he said, every time I do a renewable project, my stock goes down. People don't want me investing in it. Jeff said, we've got to change your shareholders. Jeff went on the board. He worked with the CEO. They have gone from 85% down to 15% on their way to zero. They're now on the Norges list. But the best part of it for investors, and this doesn't happen all the time, was the multiple went from 9 to 16. So it was great for the shareholders. To find that mix where you make the move to renewables and your stock goes up is really tough. And that says to asset owners, are you ready to actually take a long-term view? Yep. BP was the most aggressive of the oil majors in going with renewables. For years, their stock underperformed their peers. Then, with the windfall, they announced a stock buyback. Their stock went up to a 3-year high because of the stock buyback. Therein lies a problem. Investors have got to be willing to buy into the long-term renewable answer, because you're not going to have CEOs like Bernard Looney was, or still is, totally committed to the green agenda, but he couldn't keep underperforming. And you can't expect him to, unless shareholders say this underperforming is going to be in the long term good for us.
Ron, how would you answer a critic that believes engagement is a strategy that prioritizes values over value?
Well, I would just say it's simply not true. Again, I go back to, we are very long-term holders of a company. As long as it's in the index, we'll be an investor in it. And if you think about risk, investment risk, risk is nothing more than the proposition that more things can happen that will happen. Mm-hmm. And if you add time to that, and you think about over time, the amount of things that can happen multiplies. So for us, it's all about this proposition. We're a permanent holder here. We have to think about the long term, not just the next quarter, not just the next year, but what are those things that actually could change things? Very basically, if you think about an oil and gas company, how do you think about demand? If demand's going down, which it should go down as renewables grow, where are you going to put your capital? Are you going to continue to put it into a declining asset, or are you going to put it into, as Lynn was describing, into renewables? So for us, it's all about value. We've all got our personal set of values. They actually don't belong in portfolio management on behalf of others. Your personal portfolio management, have at it. But for us, it's all about value, and the value being created for the actual owners of the capital.
I personally find that, like dichotomy, a total cheap shot, because we've got to step back. What is the purpose of the corporation? The purpose of the corporation is to profitably solve the problems of people and planet, not to become part of the planet's problems. And so we can lose our entire ability to survive in society if we're going to only support companies that create great shareholder value but destroy lives or destroy the planet. So it's not really values versus value. It's what is the purpose of the corporation, which is another thing that I think is fundamental to what every investor, what every CEO should be thinking about as a North Star.
One, yes. Thank you.
Thanks to you. You're the people who do it.
Okay, we've got like 45 seconds left. What role, this is going to be a good setup for our next conversation, what role can state and federal policies play in inspiring more stakeholder engagement? I want both of you to address this as succinctly as possible, please. Ron, you first.
Yeah, I think companies and governments need to work together on this problem. It's not going to be solved by one or the other. And what government can do is actually provide capital in the places where the corporation or the private investor can't. taking some of that risk off the table. I talked about developing markets earlier. There's a lot of risk in developing markets, political risk and things like that. If you can work together and actually say, the government's going to take this little slice of political risk, and then the rest of it's going to come in from the private sector, that kind of blended finance solution will actually accelerate the investment that we need in these developing markets.
Lynn.
When I first started worrying about the state of our financial markets after the financial crisis, I talked to people like Peter Orszag and Larry Summers, and they said, we've got to get government policy to make these changes. I said, no, 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 no. Investors and CEOs will be motivated to do the right thing no matter what. I was 180 degrees wrong. We've got to have government be a partner in creating the right kind of law and regulatory situation, carrot and stick, to, as Barack Obama used, to bend the arc of history toward justice. We need government to push us to do the right thing.
And the IRA is a great example of that. The set of incentives, I mean, there's no industry choosing, there's no technology choosing in there. It's a set of incentives that applies everywhere. It's a great example.
It is a great example, and I'm sorry we can't give you more, but please thank both of our speakers here, Ron and Lynn. Terrific. Terrific conversation. And we're going to head off. But as I head off, I'm going to welcome back to the stage Grant Harrison.